Your grandmother's kitchen ran on knowledge with no page number and no name. There was a particular smell at a particular point, a shade of brown on the crust that meant the thing was done, a hand that moved without stopping because it knew. You ate at that table for years and never thought to ask. 20 recipes, scattered through black families across this country. Most of them are gone. Section 1. Tea cakes. A glass jar, turned upside down and pressed into the rolled-out dough. That was the cutter. Your grandmother did not own a set of cookie cutters in a tin, or if she did not reach for them when she made these. She reached for whatever glass was closest. A jelly jar, a juice glass, something with a clean rim, and she pressed it down and twisted it just slightly and lifted it away, and the round of dough came with it. You watched this from somewhere behind her, from the floor or from a chair pulled up too close to the counter, and the whole kitchen smelled like vanilla and nutmeg and something browning at the edges, and you did not know yet that what she was making had a name older than anyone in that house. Tea cakes. That is what they were called, and that name goes back further than most people realize. The recipe, in one form or another, traces to the 1600s, carried forward across more than 3 centuries, through a chain of women who learned it by standing in the same position you were standing in. Not from a card, not from a book. From watching, from tasting the dough off a finger, from the particular texture of it when it was right. The measurements, to the degree any existed, were something like a good handful of this, and enough of that, and you will know when it feels ready. That was not imprecision. It was a different kind of knowledge, one that lived in the hands rather than on a page. Culinary historians trace the Black American tea cake to the kitchens of the antebellum South, where enslaved African American cooks observed the delicate European confections that appeared on their enslavers' tables, and, with the far more limited ingredients available to them, built their own version. The result was simpler, humbler, somewhere between a cookie and a small cake, with crisp golden edges and a center that stayed soft. Brown sugar, molasses, flour, nutmeg, vanilla, and whatever fat was on hand. No elaborate technique, no special equipment. Because writing and reading were illegal in many states during that period, the recipe traveled the only way it could, spoken from one set of hands to another, adjusted slightly with each generation in a way that made every family's version genuinely different from every other family's version, even if they used the same 5 ingredients. By the time the Civil War ended and black families began building independent lives across the South and later into northern cities during the Great Migration, the tea cake moved with them. It showed up at church potlucks and burial repasts, at christenings and family reunions, at the kind of small gathering where the food was expected to do more than feed people. A plate of tea cakes on a table meant someone in that house had time and intention for you. They were not festive in a showy way. They were festive in the older sense, meaning that someone had made something with care, with no occasion large enough to require it. You did not think about any of that when you were small. You just knew they tasted like something that belonged to you specifically. The thing that made them impossible to fully replicate later, once your grandmother was gone, was that the recipe was never fixed in the first place. Every family's version was slightly different. Some were flavored with lemon zest. Some used evaporated milk. Some leaned hard on the nutmeg. Some used almost none. One grandmother cut them thick and let them stay soft all the way through. Another rolled them thin and got something closer to a crisp wafer at the edges. These were not variations on the same dish. They were essentially different dishes that happened to share a name, and when the woman who made your particular version was gone, so was that version. The family down the street still made theirs and it was good, but it was not the same, and no one could quite explain why, because the explanation was not in any ingredient. It was in the hands that were no longer there. Food historian Michael Twitty, whose 2017 book The Cooking Gene traced the roots of African American foodways across generations, documented the way this kind of knowledge resisted preservation by design. You could not simply write it down after the fact. The texture of the dough before it went in the oven, the color on the bottom of the pan that told you to pull them now, the exact moment to lift the glass away cleanly. These were things your grandmother did not perform for you as a lesson. She just did them and you were supposed to be watching. A writer named Elbert Mackey understood what was disappearing and spent years collecting what he called the tea cake roundup, gathering family stories and recipes in an attempt to catch what was vanishing before it finished vanishing. The problem was that the stories were easier to collect than the recipes, because even when people tried to write the recipes down, what came out was different from the original, because the original was never a recipe. It was a practice, a physical memory, a thing the body knew before the mind had words for it. By the 1980s, as convenience baking products became standard in most American kitchens, and the Sunday afternoon rhythm that once made a batch of tea cakes possible began disappearing from households where both parents were working longer hours, the tea cake started its slow withdrawal from the family table. Etha Robinson, who founded the African American Food Association and later launched her own tea cake business after retiring in 2007, spent decades watching people react with genuine surprise that tea cakes still existed at all. That surprise was itself a signal. Something does not get surprising unless it has already become rare. In 1963, a book called Christmas Gift by children's librarian Charlemagne Rollins documented how enslaved people were permitted to make tea cakes during the Christmas season, one of the few moments of relative freedom in the kitchen. A treat that once marked the outer edge of what was allowed had become, a century later, a thing people were startled to remember. The kitchen that produced them as a matter of course had been replaced by something faster, and what was lost in that exchange had no label on it. Nobody wrote it down because nobody thought they needed to. You ate those tea cakes at a table where the recipe was never mentioned, because why would it be? Up next, a pot that sat on the stove all day and smelled like it had been going since the night before. Section 2. Neck bones and rice. Before you even got out of bed on certain Saturdays, you knew what was happening in the kitchen. The smell reached you first, something deep and pork-heavy and slow. The kind of smell that meant something had been going since early and was going to keep going until it was ready, not until any particular time on a clock. You came around the corner and the pot was right there on the back burner, lid rattling softly, a thin line of steam escaping from the side. Whatever was in there, it had been in there a while. Your grandmother was doing something else by now. She had put it on and walked away, because that was the only technique it required. Pork neck bones. Most people who did not grow up with them walked right past the package at the meat counter without a second look, because there was not much to see. Small, angular, more bone than meat, irregular in shape, nothing like the cuts arranged in clean rows a few feet down the case. But your grandmother did not walk past them. She knew exactly what was in that package, which was not the meat itself, but the collagen packed into the connective tissue, and the marrow locked inside those bones, neither of which looked like anything at all, and both of which would transform 3 hours later into something that made a pot of plain water taste like a meal. The history of this cut in Black American households is the same history as so many other cuts that became central to soul food. Enslaved African Americans were given the portions of the hog that their enslavers did not want: the feet, the ears, the intestines, the tails, and the neck. These were not the scarps of a bad animal. They were the offcuts of a well-raised hog that happened to require more time and knowledge to cook properly, which is precisely why the people who received them learned to cook them better than anyone. What looked like nothing on the butcher's table became, in a black grandmother's kitchen, the foundation of a dish that fed a family of 8 on a weekday for almost no money at all. The technique was never complicated. You washed the neck bones first, cleaning them the way your grandmother cleaned all meat before it went in the pot, thoroughly and without apology, because that was simply how it was done. Then you seasoned them: garlic, onion, black pepper, paprika, sometimes a bay leaf, sometimes a pinch of cayenne, and you browned them in the pot first to develop the surface, because she knew that the brown on the outside meant flavor later. Then water, enough to cover, and the heat came down low. From that point, the pot handled itself, 3 hours at minimum, sometimes closer to 4. The collagen in the bones broke down slowly into gelatin, and the marrow seeped out into the water, and the fat from the meat rendered into the liquid, until what you had in that pot was no longer water in any meaningful sense. It was a broth that had structure and weight and a richness that store-bought stock has never come close to. Then came the part that made this dish what it was, rather than just a bowl of braised bones. You did not cook rice separately and serve it alongside. You cooked the rice in that broth. You ladled the liquid into a separate pot and you brought it up to a boil and you added your rice and you let every grain sit in that pork-heavy, collagen-thickened liquid for 20 minutes while it absorbed all of it. Every grain came out seasoned from the inside. The rice tasted like the pot had tasted, which meant the rice tasted like hours of slow heat and pork bone and garlic and the particular patience required to make something from nothing. When it was done, you put the neck bones over the top and the remaining broth over that. The whole plate was the same dish, unified, each part inseparable from the other. What your grandmother was doing, without any culinary terminology to describe it or any formal training to validate it, was building depth through a process that professional kitchens have since given names to and built reputations around. The technique of braising tough, collagen-dense cuts low and slow until the connective tissue dissolves into the cooking liquid is now described in culinary school textbooks and demonstrated at food festivals. The results show up on restaurant menus in cities where the neighborhoods that originally produced this food have long since been priced out. The cut itself, which once retailed for under $2 a pound because almost nobody outside of soul food households wanted it, has steadily climbed as that knowledge has spread outward. Pork neck bones in a grocery store today run between $2 and $4 a pound depending on the region, which is modest by most meat standards, but a steep climb from what your grandmother used to pay for a cut that was essentially being given away. What climbed with the price, though, was not the recipe. The recipe stayed in the pot. It stayed with the woman who knew that the broth had to reach a particular color before it was ready for the rice, who knew by the way the steam smelled whether the bone still had more to give, who did not time this dish with a clock because the clock had nothing to do with it. When that woman was gone, most families found they could approximate the dish but not fully recover it. The ratio of broth to rice, the exact seasoning balance, the moment to pull the bones before they gave up their last bit of meat. Those were judgments that lived in the body of a particular person and could not be fully transferred by description alone. That was simply what the back burner was for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just learned about a cut that cost almost nothing and paid back everything. The next recipe involved a different kind of patience, one that started not with a pot but with a cast iron pan, and a piece of meat that had to be handled in exactly the right order before it would give you anything worth eating. Section 3. Smothered pork chops. The sound it made when it hit the pan told you something was about to happen. A hard, immediate sizzle, the kind that meant the oil was exactly where it needed to be, not too cool, not smoking, just right. And the chop landed flat, and the kitchen filled up in under 10 seconds with a smell that was different from any other smell in that house. Not the slow, quiet build of a pot that had been going all morning. This was immediate. This was browning happening right now, and you could hear it and smell it and feel the warmth from 2 rooms away, and you knew without anyone telling you that dinner was going to be something specific tonight. The cast iron skillet sat on the front burner, not the back one, because this recipe required attention. Your grandmother did not put smothered pork chops on and walk away. She stood there. She watched the chop develop its color, that deep golden brown crust on the first side before she flipped it, and she made the call about when to flip based on what she could see and hear, not on any timer. Bone-in chops? Always, because the bone changes what happens to the meat during cooking, and she knew that even if she never said it in those words. Thin chops would have given up and dried out. Thick ones, with the bone, held on through everything that was about to happen to them. What happened to them was the technique, and the technique had a lineage that ran back further than the kitchen you were standing in. The smothering method in African American cooking grew out of a convergence of traditions. West African cooks who understood low-heat, covered pot cooking as a fundamental approach to building flavor from modest ingredients, and French Creole technique that arrived in Louisiana and gave the method its formal vocabulary, the word étouffée, which translates simply as smothered, meaning the same thing your grandmother was doing in a kitchen several states away, without any French in the description at all. As black families moved northward during the Great Migration, which stretched from roughly 1910 through 1970 and carried 6 million black Americans out of the South, they carried smothered dishes with them as a way of keeping something of home in a place that was nothing like it. The dish spread from Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama into Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia and New York, and in each city it found a cast iron pan and a woman who knew exactly what to do with it. The chop itself was not actually the recipe. The gravy was the recipe. Once your grandmother pulled the brown chops from the pan and set them aside, she turned her attention to what was left behind in the skillet, and what was left was the foundation of everything. The brown bits stuck to the bottom of the cast iron, the rendered fat, the dark residue of the sear, all of it staying in the pan while she added onions first and let them go low and slow until they released their liquid and turned soft and translucent, sometimes almost caramelized at the edges. Some versions added celery and bell pepper alongside, the same aromatic base that runs through so much of Louisiana-influenced Southern cooking. Some did not. There was no singular correct version. There was your grandmother's version, and then there were other versions that were good but were not the same. When the onions were where she wanted them, the flour went in, just enough to coat the pan and start a roux, and she stirred that continuously because she knew exactly how long it could sit without burning, which was not very long at all. Then the liquid came in, water or broth, deglazing the pan and pulling up everything that had stuck to the bottom, dissolving all of it into the gravy in a way that changed the color and the depth of what was in the pan immediately. The smell shifted. The thin liquid thickened as she worked it, and she tasted it and adjusted it and tasted it again, adding seasoning not all at once but in stages, building towards something she could feel was right before she could describe what right meant. Then the chops went back in, nested into the gravy, and the lid went on, and the heat came down, and from that point the pan did the work. 30 to 40 minutes, the chops finishing in that covered environment, softening, the meat coming away from the bone with almost no resistance, the gravy absorbing the last of what the pork had to give. What you ate at the end was inseparable from the process that created it. The gravy tasted like the sear and the onions and the flour and the broth and the seasoning and the time the chops spent cooking inside it. All of those things combined into something that had no single ingredient you could point to and say that is what makes this taste the way it tastes. When people have tried to write the recipe down afterward, working from memory, they get the steps right and the result is close, genuinely close, and still not quite the same. Because the variable that is hardest to capture in writing is the hand that made the gravy, the specific decisions about when the onions were ready, how dark to take the roux, how much flour, how much liquid, when to put the lid on, how low to bring the heat. Those decisions were made through touch and sight and smell and a kind of accumulated certainty that came from making this dish dozens of times in the same pan in the same kitchen. A written recipe can tell you what went in. It cannot tell you how it went in. The plate came to the table looking like the work it was. Up next, something that started outside in a garden or at a roadside stand and spent the rest of the day on the stove, and the longer it cooked, the further it got from the vegetable it started as. Section 4. Collard greens. Long before the pot went on, there was the sink. You watched your grandmother pull the leaves from the bunch one at a time and lay them into a basin of cold water and let them sit, and then she drained it and did it again, and sometimes a third time, and what settled to the bottom of that sink each time was a thin film of grit and field dust that you would never have known was there by looking at the leaves themselves. The cleaning was not a step before the recipe. It was the first part of the recipe, and it carried the same attention as everything that came after it. A leaf that had not been cleaned properly could ruin the whole pot, not because of taste but because of texture, and she knew that without anyone ever writing it down. Collard greens are one of the oldest cultivated vegetables on record, a member of the Brassica family that traces back to the Eastern Mediterranean, and that West African cooks had incorporated into their own cooking traditions centuries before the transatlantic slave trade began. When enslaved African Americans were permitted to grow small plots of their own, collard greens were among the very few crops they were allowed to cultivate. The choice was partly practical, because the plant is hardy and grows even in poor soil through cold weather, but the fact that enslaved people maintained the tradition of cooking it low and slow in a seasoned, fatty broth reflected something carried from West Africa, where bitter leafy vegetables had long been simmered down into a rich, deeply flavored cooking liquid that became as important as the greens themselves. That liquid, the pot liquor, was not a byproduct, it was the point. After the sink came the stem. Your grandmother folded each leaf in half lengthwise, running her thumb along the rib and pulling it out in one motion, discarding the tough center stalk that would never soften no matter how long it cooked. Then she rolled several leaves together tightly, the way you would roll a piece of paper, and she sliced across the roll into ribbons about an inch wide, and the knife went through cleanly because she kept it sharp. The pile of raw greens on the cutting board looked enormous, the kind of pile that seemed like it would never fit in any pot, and then you watched them go in and collapse almost immediately under the heat into something a quarter of their original volume. That collapse was the first transformation, and there were several more to come. The ham hock went in before the greens. Your grandmother browned it first in the pot with onion and garlic, building a base in the bottom of the pan that would carry into everything poured in after it. Ham hocks are the lower leg joint of the pig, a cut that contains little actual meat, but enormous amounts of collagen and smoke, and when they are given enough time in a hot liquid, they give that liquid everything they have. She added water or broth, brought it up to heat, and then the greens went in stages, pressed down as they wilted, pressed down again as more room opened up. Then the lid went on, and the heat came down, and the pot began its long, slow work. 3 hours was the floor, not the ceiling. Some pots went longer. The transformation that happened across those hours was genuinely difficult to believe if you had never witnessed it. The bitter, almost sharp raw leaf that would have made you wince if you tasted it off the cutting board became something unrecognizable by the time it was done, silky and rich and carrying the smoke of the ham hock in every strand, with the bitterness not removed but somehow converted into depth. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in somewhere in the middle of the cook, its acidity cutting through the fat and the smoke and pulling the flavors into alignment, and some grandmothers added a pinch of sugar for balance at the same point, and some did not, and the ones who did not would have disagreed firmly with the ones who did. There was no universally agreed upon version. There was your family's version and everyone else's. The pot liquor that remained at the bottom when the greens were done was the thing food scholar Jessica B. Harris described as central to the entire tradition. In her research into African American foodways, Harris documented how the habit of simmering greens into a rich cooking broth and using bread to sop up what remained traced directly back to West African meal structure, where a stew over a starch had been the fundamental pattern of a complete meal for centuries. The cornbread served alongside a pot of collard greens was not an accident of pairing. It was the other half of the same dish, designed to carry the liquid that the spoon could not reach. You tore a piece of cornbread and dragged it across the bottom of the bowl, and what came up on that bread was concentrated and smoky and faintly sweet and deeply pork-flavored, and it was, by any reasonable measure, the best part of the plate. What made every grandmother's pot unrepeatable was the accumulation of small decisions across 3 hours of cooking. How much vinegar, whether any sugar, how far down to take the onions before the liquid went in, what ratio of water to broth, how long past tender she was willing to let them go, because some grandmothers cooked theirs until the greens were almost yielding to nothing, and others pulled them while there was still some texture left, and neither was wrong. They were just different recipes that happened to carry the same name. The pre-washed, pre-chopped bag of collard greens that began appearing widely in grocery stores during the 1990s made the dish faster to start and further from what came out of a morning that began with a sink full of cold water and a grandmother who was not in any hurry. The pot always told you what time it was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just watched a bitter leaf spend 3 hours becoming something else entirely. The next recipe also started as something plain and came out transformed, but the transformation happened in a mixing bowl and an oven, and what it produced was the one thing your grandmother made that nobody in the family has successfully replicated since. Section 5. Pound cake. The tube pan came out first. That was how you knew. Not the mixing bowl, not the butter sitting on the counter, but that specific pan, dark with use around the edges, a little warped maybe from years of heat, with a hollow center tube and straight high sides, and your grandmother greased it the way she always greased it, with shortening worked into every surface by hand, getting into the seam where the tube met the base, and then she dusted it with flour and turned it upside down and tapped it over the sink, and what fell out was excess, and what stayed was a thin coating that would do exactly one job perfectly. All of that happened before she touched a single ingredient. The preparation of the pan was its own step, taken seriously, because she had seen what happened when you rushed it. Pound cake, in its original form, was almost arithmetically simple. The name came from the formula: 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of eggs, 1 pound of flour. That was the entire recipe as it existed in 18th century Europe, carried to the American South, and taken over by the hands that were already doing most of the cooking there. Before electric mixers became common household appliances in the 1920s and 1930s, the creaming of butter and sugar was done with a wooden spoon and whatever strength was in the person's arms, and it took a long time, and the texture of the finished cake depended entirely on how long and how thoroughly the baker had beaten air into that butter. That was not a technique you could describe to someone. That was a physical skill, learned by doing it until your arm learned how it was supposed to feel. In 1881, a woman named Abby Fisher published a cookbook called What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, which contained 2-pound cake recipes, one she called gold and one she called silver, each leavened with whipped egg whites. Fisher had been born into slavery in Orangeburg, South Carolina, around 1831, had worked as a plantation cook through emancipation, and had eventually made her way to San Francisco, where she ran a pickling and preserves business that won awards at the California State Fair. She could not read or write at the time of publication. She dictated the entire cookbook from memory, with friends transcribing what she said, working through a heavy Southern accent that sometimes gave her scribes trouble. Those 2-pound cakes went into the first published African-American cookbook in the country, entirely from her head, from a body of knowledge she had never once put on paper, because paper had not been the point. That is the lineage your grandmother's cake came from, not from a recipe card she found in a magazine. From a chain of women who adjusted and adapted and improved across generations, turning a simple 4-ingredient formula into something layered and personal. The adaptations Black grandmothers brought to the pound cake are the reason it tastes the way it does in a Black household rather than the way it tastes anywhere else. Sour cream for moisture, added to keep the crumb from going dry at the density a pound cake naturally tends toward. Cream cheese in some versions for tang and richness that the butter alone could not provide. Vanilla extract, always, and sometimes a measure of almond extract alongside it, and sometimes a whisper of nutmeg in the flour, and the exact proportions of those additions were not written anywhere because the person who made them did it by feel and by taste, adjusting based on the batter in front of her rather than any fixed number. The creaming was where most attempts at replication broke down. Your grandmother creamed the butter and sugar together for longer than any recipe would tell you to, working the mixer on medium until the mixture was pale and almost white and had increased noticeably in volume, and then she kept going, because she knew the texture of the finished cake was being set during those minutes at the bowl, not during the time it spent in the oven. Most people who try to recreate a grandmother's pound cake stop the creaming too soon. The batter looks ready before it actually is, and the person making it moves on, and the finished cake is close but slightly denser, slightly less tender, a version of the right thing rather than the right thing itself. The pound cake carried weight in Black community life that had nothing to do with how it tasted. At church functions, the baker known for her pound cake held a specific kind of status, recognized at potlucks and socials as belonging to a particular tier of skill. At funerals and repasts, a pound cake on the table meant someone had taken serious time for the grieving family, because this was not a cake you made in 40 minutes. At family reunions held in parks and church basements across the South and up through every northern city where Black families had resettled during the Great Migration, the pound cake arrived wrapped in foil and placed at the end of the table and was among the first things to disappear. During the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956, a cook named Georgia Gilmore organized what became known as the Club from Nowhere, selling pound cakes and other food to raise money for the boycott's transportation fund, channeling a domestic skill into direct political action in a way that the authorities could not easily track because it looked, on the surface, like nothing more than women baking. When the cake came out of the oven, it had a crack running along the top of the crust, a golden split that your grandmother understood to be correct, not a flaw. The crust was firm and slightly caramelized, and the crumb inside was dense but gave way cleanly, and the cake pulled away from the sides of the pan in a way that meant the greasing had worked exactly as intended. She cooled it in the pan for 20 minutes before turning it out, and she did not rush that either, because the structure needed to set, and she knew that, and there was nothing to do but wait. Every family has tried to write it down after the fact and gotten something good, which is not the same thing. The next recipe also depended on time and heat and a particular understanding of when something was done, but it started outdoors, came inside carrying the smell of summer, and ended in a pan that had been in the family longer than anyone could remember. Section 6. Peach Cobbler. Summer arrived at your grandmother's kitchen in a paper bag. Someone had stopped at a roadside stand or come back from a neighbor's yard with a load of peaches, and the bag went on the counter, and even before it was opened, the whole room had already shifted. That smell, which is not a subtle smell, thick and warm and almost overripe, the way a peach smells only when it has fully arrived at what it was going to be, and will not hold there for long. Your grandmother did not store them. She did not wait. Peaches at that moment of ripeness had a window measured in days, not weeks, and she knew it, and the cast iron pan was coming out today. The peeling happened first. A paring knife pulled across the skin in short strokes, the flesh underneath pale golden wet, the juice running immediately down the hand and onto the cutting board, and then the pit pulled free and the peach fell apart in halves, and those halves went into slices, and the slices went into a bowl with sugar and cinnamon and a grating of nutmeg and sometimes a teaspoon of vanilla, and your grandmother let that sit while she turned to the pan. The cast iron skillet or the deep baking dish went into the oven with a block of butter in it, and while the oven came up to heat, the butter melted and coated the bottom, and when she poured the batter over that melted butter, the two did not fully mix, and that was the point, and she knew it. Peach cobbler's roots in Black American cooking run to the plantation kitchens of the antebellum South, where enslaved cooks worked with whatever was available and adapted European fruit pudding traditions to cast iron pots baked over open coals. The earliest version was essentially repurposed biscuit dough, dropped in rough mounds over sliced or preserved fruit, and cooked in whatever vessel held heat. There was no precise recipe because there was no recipe at all, only an approach: fruit, fat, flour, fire, and enough time. After emancipation, as flour and sugar became affordable for Black households throughout the South in the later half of the 19th century, the cobbler moved from necessity into tradition, and Black cooks began putting their own structure and preference into what the topping was and how it behaved. The debate that has divided black families about peach cobbler longer than anyone can document is the question of the topping. Some grandmothers made a true biscuit crust, cut cold butter into flour and rolled it out and laid it over the peaches in a solid sheet that baked into something flaky and firm, more pie adjacent than cobbler. Others dropped the dough in irregular pieces over the fruit, which produced a rougher, more uneven surface, with soft spots and crisp edges, and no two bites the same. And then there was the approach your grandmother may have used, pouring a loose batter, almost pancake thin, over melted butter in the bottom of the pan, and then spooning the sugared peaches on top, and putting the whole thing in the oven and letting the batter rise up through the fruit as it baked, surrounding it rather than covering it, the peaches suspended inside something that was neither biscuit nor cake but a specific third thing that has no precise name. That version produced a cobbler where the bottom was soft and buttery, and barely distinct from the fruit, and the top was golden and slightly crisp, and the peaches had given up their juice into everything around them, and the whole pan was the same dish from edge to center. None of these approaches was wrong. Each was correct within the logic of the person who made it, and each produced a different cobbler that happened to carry the same name, which meant that when people said peach cobbler, they were describing a wide range of specific things, and the specific thing your grandmother made was the one that meant cobbler to you, and all others were measured against it whether you intended to measure them or not. The freestone peach was the variety most associated with this tradition in the South, the yellow-fleshed summer peach whose pit pulled cleanly from the flesh rather than clinging to it, making it possible to have and slice without fighting the fruit. In good years, families with backyard peach trees would bring in more than they could eat, and the cobbler was how the surplus became useful before it became waste, a dessert born partly from abundance and partly from the practical refusal to let ripe fruit rot. In leaner seasons, or in northern cities where peach trees were not part of the landscape, canned peaches stood in, and a grandmother who knew what she was doing could make canned peaches taste close to fresh, through the right balance of brown sugar and spice, and enough time in a hot oven, though she would not claim they were the same thing. What the recipe could not carry forward after she was gone was the specific pan. Cast iron retains and distributes heat differently from any other material, and a well-seasoned skillet that had been used for cobblers for 30 years had absorbed something from every batch it had ever held, a surface that had been built up through decades of use into something that functioned better than a new pan in ways that are real but difficult to articulate. The cobbler that came out of that pan tasted the way it did partly because of what went into it and partly because of where it was made. Families who inherited the pan had a better chance of getting close. Families who did not started from a different point. The syrup at the bottom of the dish was what you scraped the pan for when everyone else had taken their portion and moved to the porch. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just watched summer come inside and turn into something that lasted. The next recipe worked in the opposite direction. It started in the cold months, when the garden was done, and it required a whole bird and a long afternoon, and a kind of patience that is harder to come by than it used to be. Section 7. Chicken and dumplings. Cold weather was when this pot came out. Not quite winter, but past the point where the garden had anything left to offer. The kind of afternoon where the light went flat early, and the house needed something going on the stove to make itself feel right. Your grandmother filled the pot with cold water and put the whole bird in before the water was even warm, because she knew that starting a chicken in cold water and bringing it up slowly pulled more from the bones than dropping it into boiling liquid, and she had never read that in any cookbook. She knew it because she had done it enough times that her hands knew it before her mind did. Before chicken became what it is now, before the mass production of poultry that began reshaping American grocery stores in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s, a whole chicken was not an everyday purchase. It was a deliberate one. The bird that went into the pot was often an older hen, past her laying years, or an old rooster whose flesh had been worked and toughened by the better part of a life. The conventional wisdom would have told you this was a lesser ingredient. In practice, it was a superior one. Older birds have more developed muscle, more collagen in the connective tissue, more flavor worked through the meat by years of movement, and when they are given enough time in a slow simmer, they give all of that to the liquid around them in a way that a young supermarket chicken, bred for fast growth and large breast meat, never fully does. The broth that came off an old hen after 2 hours on a low flame was not the same liquid that went in. It had become something else, thick with dissolved collagen and fat, amber-colored, smelling of the celery and onion and bay leaf and peppercorns that had gone in alongside the bird. And it was the broth, far more than any individual component that followed, that made the dish what it was. Dumplings have appeared in American cooking since well before the Civil War, connected to British boiled pudding traditions that arrived with early settlers and took root across the South and Midwest alongside whatever meat was available and cheap. The version associated specifically with Black Southern cooking was the slick dumpling, also called a slicker, sometimes called chicken and pastry depending on where you were and who your people were. This was not the fluffy, cloud-like drop dumpling of northern kitchens, made from a wet biscuit batter spooned directly into simmering broth. This was a rolled dough, cut flat and thin, somewhere between a noodle and a biscuit in its geometry but belonging to neither category. Your grandmother made it with flour, a measure of shortening, a little salt, a pinch of baking powder, and just enough cold water to bring it together. And she worked it only as much as she needed to, because she knew that working it too much made the dumplings tough, and she knew that without looking it up. The dough went onto the floured board and the rolling pin came out, and she rolled it thinner than you expected, thin enough to see light through if you held it up, and then she cut it into strips or rough rectangles, irregular at the edges, which was not a mistake. By the time the dumplings were ready, the chicken had been in the pot for close to 2 hours. She lifted it out and set it aside in a pan to cool, and while it cooled, she brought the broth back up to a simmer and began dropping the dumplings in one at a time, laying them across the surface of the liquid and letting them sink. What happened next was the specific chemistry of this dish, the thing that made it fundamentally different from soup. The flour in the dumplings dissolved slowly into the broth as they cooked, thickening the liquid from the inside without any roux, without any cornstarch, just the starch from the dough releasing into the surrounding liquid over 15 or 20 minutes of low, steady heat, until what had been a clear and fragrant broth was something closer to gravy. Meanwhile, the chicken had cooled enough to handle, and she worked it with her hands, pulling every piece of meat from every bone, separating it into irregular pieces that went back into the pot, and the bones went into the trash, and everything that had been on that bird was now in the bowl. The dish that came to the table was unified in a way that few others were. Every component had spent time in the same liquid, had given something to and received something from everything else in the pot. The dumpling carried the flavor of the broth it cooked in. The chicken had been shaped by hours in that same broth before it ever left the pot. The liquid itself was everything that had been put into it across the afternoon, reduced and concentrated and thickened into something that functioned as both broth and gravy, and coating all at once. When the bowl was set in front of you, there was nothing in it that did not belong. People commonly credit the Great Depression with inventing this dish, which has the logic of feeling right without being accurate. Stewed meat with dumpling-like dough cooked in broth appears in American cooking records from Mary Randolph's 1836 cookbook onward, and in related forms in European kitchens long before the American South gave it the shape most people recognize today. What the Depression did, along with every other period of economic strain that black families weathered across the 19th and 20th centuries, was confirm the dish as essential, because a single old chicken could feed a table of 8 people when the dumplings were right and the broth had been properly coaxed. 1 bird, an afternoon, a pot. That was the arithmetic, and your grandmother understood it without calling it arithmetic. What the mass-produced chicken gradually took away was the broth. A young bird raised in a few weeks on an industrial schedule does not have enough time to develop what an old hen carried in her bones, and the broth that comes off a modern supermarket chicken, even when simmered for hours, lacks the body and depth of what this recipe required. Families who kept making it noticed, even if they did not say so directly. The dumplings were the same. The chicken was more tender. The pot was not. Nobody talked about what had changed, but everyone at the table could tell. Up next, a cut of meat that used to cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted it, that black grandmothers slow cooked into something that the rest of the world eventually came looking for, and when they found it, the price went with them. Section 8. Oxtail Stew. Pick one up and feel the weight of it. That is the first thing you notice about oxtail, the heft, more than you expect from a piece of meat with that much bone in it, dense and irregular, a cross-section of tail cut through the vertebrae, each piece slightly different in diameter depending on where it came from along the length of the animal. The marbling runs all the way through, fat threaded between the meat and the bone and the thick connective tissue that encases the whole thing, and that connective tissue is exactly what most people in a grocery store did not know what to do with, which is exactly why the package used to be so cheap, and why your grandmother always bought it when she saw it, and why the pot she made from it was one of the richest things that ever came out of her kitchen. Oxtail is classified as offal, the parts of the animal left behind after the primary butchering is done, the category of cuts that historically moved to the bottom of any hierarchy of desirability. During the American slave trade, enslaved Africans received offal because those who enslaved them did not want it. The same story played out in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, where enslaved people on sugar and cattle plantations were given the tail, the feet, the snout, the parts that wealthy residents of the island passed over for leaner and more expensive cuts. What happened in every one of those kitchens, separated by water and circumstance but connected by the same original dispossession, was the same. Those cuts were cooked low and slow until they gave up everything they had, and what came out of that process was something the people who threw the cuts away never ate and never knew. The sear came first. Your grandmother got the pan or the Dutch oven hot, hotter than you might think was appropriate, and she laid the oxtail pieces in it without crowding them, because crowding meant steaming rather than browning, and she understood the difference between a piece of meat that had been browned and a piece of meat that had been heated, and she understood that difference without anyone explaining the chemistry behind it. The surface of each piece had to caramelize, had to develop a dark, fragrant crust on every exposed side before anything else went into the pot, because that crust was going to become the flavor of the finished dish in a way that nothing added later could replicate. She did this in batches, setting each finished piece aside, and then the onions went into the same pot with all the fat that the oxtail had rendered, and the garlic followed, and the tomato paste, and she let all of it cook down in the residue of the sear before any liquid touched the pan. The liquid that went in varied by family and by region and by what Caribbean influence was in the kitchen. Some grandmothers used straight beef broth. Some used a combination of broth and Worcestershire sauce, which contributed a dark, fermented depth. Some added allspice berries or thyme, bringing a flavoring tradition that traced directly to Jamaican cooking, where the dish had been developed in parallel with the Southern American version across centuries of shared history. Culinary historian Adrian Miller, who has spent years documenting the connections between Caribbean and African American foodways, has described how oxtail preparation in these communities represents a genuine transatlantic conversation, different kitchens arriving at similar knowledge through similar circumstances. Your grandmother may not have known that description, but she knew the pot. Once the liquid was in and the oxtails had gone back, the lid went on and the heat dropped to something barely above a whisper. 3 hours was the minimum. 4 was better. What was happening inside the pot during those hours was specific and irreplaceable. The collagen packed into the connective tissue surrounding each piece of oxtail was slowly converting to gelatin, the protein structure dissolving in the low heat and releasing into the cooking liquid, transforming it from a thin broth into something thick and glossy and almost sticky at the edges, a liquid that coated a spoon and held there. The meat itself, which was tough enough to resist a fork at the beginning, became tender enough at the end to pull from the bone with almost no pressure. The fat that had run through each piece had rendered into the broth and become part of its richness. Everything in the pot had given itself to everything else, and what remained after 4 hours was a unified thing that had no single dominant ingredient, only a depth that accumulated. A sale on oxtail in an earlier era, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, could bring the price down to roughly $2 a pound. The cut was cheap because demand was narrow, concentrated in Black American households and Caribbean communities in cities like New York, Miami, and Atlanta, in neighborhoods where the people who knew how to cook it lived and shopped. Then the information moved outward. As chefs in fine dining began exploring the same offcuts that soul food had relied on for generations, the techniques and the ingredients started appearing on tasting menus and in food magazine features, described as discoveries. Oxtail began showing up in Italian restaurants as a ragu, in upscale southern establishments as a braise served over stone-ground grits, in hotel restaurants in cities where no one's grandmother had ever made it. The price followed the attention. A woman who remembered paying $2 a pound for oxtail in her neighborhood grocery store could walk into that same store 3 decades later and find it marked at $8, $10, $12 a pound. Some cuts have since reached $14 or more in major markets. The dish did not change. The people who had developed it were simply priced away from what they built. What your grandmother made cost her almost nothing and produced something that has no reasonable commercial substitute at any price. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just watched a throwaway cut get turned into something irreplaceable and then watched the world catch on. The next recipe never left the family table, never made it to a restaurant menu, and still managed to disappear anyway, one generation at a time, starting with the moment someone stopped making it from scratch. Section 9. Banana pudding. The bowl mattered. Not a pan, not a casserole dish, not any container that happened to be available. A glass bowl, deep enough to hold 3 full layers and still have room to spare. clear so you could see those layers from the outside, the pale gold custard and the cream white wafers and the banana slices running all the way through, and the meringue on top, browned at the peaks. Your grandmother owned this bowl specifically for this purpose. She may not have said that, but you noticed that nothing else ever went into it. The bowl appeared when the banana pudding appeared, and for no other reason, and both of them together were a signal that something worth waiting for was about to happen. The custard started in a double boiler. This is the detail that separated what your grandmother made from everything that came after, and it is worth being specific about what that means. A double boiler is a pot of simmering water with a second vessel set over it, the contents of the top pot heated by steam rather than direct flame, which is a slower and more controlled way to cook something delicate. What went into the top was egg yolks and sugar and flour and a measure of whole milk, and it required constant stirring with a wooden spoon or a whisk, uninterrupted, because the moment you stopped moving it, the eggs at the bottom of the pot were going to scramble. This was not a recipe you could walk away from. You stood at the stove and stirred, and watched the mixture change, going from thin and pale to thick and glossy over the course of 15 or 20 minutes, and the color deepened slightly as it cooked, going from the pale yellow of raw yolks to something richer, and the smell changed with it, going from raw egg and sugar to something warm and faintly caramelized and vanilla saturated once the extract went in at the end. When it coated the back of the spoon and held a line when you ran your finger through it, it was done. Your grandmother knew that moment without any test. Banana pudding appeared in American print as early as 1878, when the New York Times mentioned it, and Good Housekeeping published a full recipe in 1888. Those early versions used sponge cake or ladyfingers as the base layer, the way an English trifle would, which reflects where the idea came from before it landed in the American South and became something specific to black family kitchens. In 1920, a home cook named Laura Curley in Bloomington, Illinois, shared a recipe in her local newspaper that replaced the sponge cake with Nabisco vanilla wafers, and the combination caught on in a way that nothing before it had. Nabisco had been producing vanilla wafers since 1898. By the 1940s, the company was printing a banana pudding recipe directly on the box, formalizing what home cooks had already been doing for 2 decades. The wafer did not become officially named the Nilla wafer until 1967, but the recipe on that box, the one calling for homemade custard, egg whites beaten to stiff peaks for the meringue, and layering done while the custard was still warm, was the recipe your grandmother used. It was on the box and in her hands, and those two things were not in conflict because the box recipe was already what she knew. The layering had an order. Some custard first on the bottom of the bowl to keep the wafers from sliding. Then wafers, placed in overlapping rows or scattered depending on the cook. Then banana slices in a single even layer. Then more custard poured warm over everything, soaking into the wafers immediately on contact. Then another layer, done the same way, and another after that, finishing with custard spread across the top and going all the way to the edges. The meringue came last. Egg whites and sugar beaten together until they formed stiff, glossy peaks, spread over the warm custard in a layer thick enough to insulate what was underneath. The edges pressed down to the rim of the bowl to seal them, because a sealed meringue does not weep the way an unsealed one does. Then the whole bowl went into the oven, and the meringue toasted in the heat, turning golden brown at the peaks and staying white at the valleys. And the smell of it coming out was the smell of something done correctly. What happened overnight, once the bowl went into the refrigerator and the whole thing was left to settle, was the real recipe. The vanilla wafers, which had been firm when they went in, absorbed custard through the night and transformed into something soft and yielding and infused throughout with banana and vanilla, no longer a cookie in any meaningful sense, but a structural element of the pudding itself, holding its shape while tasting entirely of what surrounded it. This transformation required time. It could not be rushed, and it was the difference between banana pudding eaten the same day it was made, which was good, and banana pudding eaten the following afternoon after a night in the refrigerator, which was the real thing. The slow departure of the scratch version began in 1964, when Jell-O introduced a banana cream-flavored instant pudding mix that could be prepared in minutes with cold milk. By 1966, Cool Whip from General Mills offered a pre-made whip topping that eliminated the meringue entirely. Neither of these products produced the same thing. The egg yolk custard had a specific depth, a cooked richness, and a very slight savory undertone from the yolks that box pudding mix never reproduced because the chemistry was not the same. The meringue had a toasty, warm quality and a specific texture at the boundary where it met the custard that Cool Whip did not approach. But the new versions were faster, required no standing at the stove, required no judgment about when the custard had thickened, or when the meringue peaks were stiff enough. And across the following decades, family by family, the scratch version receded. The bowl still came out. The layers still formed. The result was still called banana pudding and was still welcome at every table. Knowing the difference required having eaten the original. Up next, a pie that sat at every holiday table in a black household across this country and has been impersonated so many times that most people have forgotten what the real one tasted like. Section 10. Sweet potato pie. Something in the air of that kitchen on a holiday morning told you it was already in the oven before you saw it. Not a sharp smell, nothing that announced itself the way frying did. Something warmer and lower than that. Cinnamon working its way through the house slowly, mixing with the smell of butter in a hot crust, and underneath all of it a sweetness that was earthy rather than sharp, the natural sugar of a roasted root vegetable slowly caramelizing in a sealed tin. You came around the corner and the pie was on the counter resting, the crust a deep golden brown at the edges, the filling set smooth across the top. Not cracked, not sunken, the surface the color of a dark autumn sunset, and it was still warm in the center, and nobody was allowed to touch it yet. Your grandmother did not boil the sweet potatoes. Some people did, and they got a filling that was wet at the edges and slightly flat in flavor, because boiling diluted what a sweet potato had to offer rather than intensifying it. She put them in the oven whole, skins on, and let them roast until they were completely soft and the skins had begun to blister and pull away from the flesh, and the sugars inside had caramelized and concentrated in a way that boiling water could never produce. When they came out and cooled enough to handle, the skins slipped off cleanly, and what remained was dense and almost sticky and smelled like something that had been transformed by heat rather than just made soft by it. That roasted sweetness was the base note of the pie, and everything else was built on top of it. The earliest known published recipe for sweet potato pie in America appeared in 1881, in the same cookbook by Abby Fisher that carried those 2-pound cake recipes dictated from memory. Fisher, born into slavery in South Carolina around 1831, had developed her recipe over a lifetime in plantation kitchens, and then in her own life in San Francisco, where she built a business from nothing and put her knowledge into print through friends who wrote down what she said. Her sweet potato pie called for butter, milk, and eggs combined with the mashed sweet potato into a custard filling in a flaky open crust, sweetened with sugar, and the custard-like version we recognize today descends in a direct line from what she described. The tradition itself, though, is older than 1881 by a considerable margin. Food historian Michael Twitty, whose research into African American foodways traces cooking practices across generations, has documented that his own family grew sweet potatoes in their garden specifically for this pie, a tradition he traced back to at least the 18th century, and one that never involved pumpkin pie at all. The divide between sweet potato and pumpkin was not simply regional. It was a line that ran between communities, between tables, between families who knew one version and considered it the only version worth making. Sweet potatoes arrived in the American South partly through West African agricultural knowledge, carried by enslaved people who recognized in them something similar to the yams they had known in their home countries. Sweet potatoes are native to Central and South America and were introduced to West Africa in the 16th century, where they took root and became a staple. When enslaved Africans arrived in the American South, they found sweet potatoes growing abundantly, and the familiar crop became a foundation of their cooking in a way that had nothing to do with scarcity and everything to do with memory and preference. The custard pie format, adapted from English tradition, gave that sweet potato a vessel, and what came out of black kitchens was something entirely its own. The spice balance was the most carefully held variable in this recipe, more guarded even than the quantity of sugar or the type of milk. Every grandmother had a specific ratio of cinnamon to nutmeg, a specific position on whether clove belonged in the filling at all, a specific feeling about ginger. Some used only cinnamon and nutmeg, which produced a warm and familiar flavor profile. Others added a measure of clove that gave the filling a deeper and slightly medicinal edge underneath all the sweetness, a complexity that made the pie taste like something taken seriously. The nutmeg was often grated fresh from a whole nutmeg rather than shaken from a jar, and the difference between freshly grated and pre-ground nutmeg is large enough that anyone who grew up eating the fresh version could taste the absence of it in a commercial pie without being able to name what was missing. Evaporated milk was the choice of many grandmothers over fresh whole milk, because evaporated milk brought a concentrated dairy richness that thickened the custard and gave the filling a smoothness that resisted cracking during baking. The filling went into the crust still raw and very loose, far looser than the finished pie would suggest, and the oven set it slowly from the outside in. A properly baked sweet potato pie had a center that still registered a very slight wobble when the pan was gently shaken, the way a creme brulee does, because it would finish setting as it cooled, and a pie pulled too early or left too long crossed two different lines of error in opposite directions. The crust was its own recipe within the recipe. Lard produced a flakier, more tender crust than vegetable shortening, because lard's fat structure created distinct layers in the dough rather than a uniform texture, and grandmothers who used it worked cold lard into cold flour with their fingertips, stopping before the mixture was fully incorporated, because the visible bits of fat were exactly what would melt in the oven and create the layers. The water that went in was ice cold, added a tablespoon at a time, and the dough was handled as little as possible after that, because warmth from the hands would melt the fat prematurely and give the crust the texture of a cracker rather than a pastry. What commercial sweet potato pies sold in grocery stores share with your grandmother's version is the name and the color. The texture is different, the spice balance is different, the crust is different in every way that matters, and the filling, made from a standardized formula rather than from roasted sweet potatoes seasoned by a particular hand, cannot produce what the original produced. This is not a failing of those products. They were not trying to be the same thing. Nobody has to explain why that pie was always gone first. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just ate the pie that anchored the holiday table for generations. The next recipe also came out at celebrations, but it required a level of skill so specific that only certain women in the family were trusted to make it, and when they were gone, so was the recipe. Section 11, Caramel Cake. Watch her watch the skillet. That is where the lesson was, if you had known to pay attention to it. She stood at the stove with the cast iron skillet over medium-low heat, and she did not look away, not to answer a question, not to respond to anything happening behind her, because what was in that skillet required everything she had. A half cup of granulated white sugar, dry, no liquid, beginning to melt at the edges and pull toward the center, and the color was changing, slowly at first and then faster, going from white to pale gold to amber, to something approaching the brown of old furniture, and at a certain exact moment that she recognized and you did not. She pulled the skillet and added the boiling water, and the whole thing hissed and steamed, and she stirred it into a syrup, and that dark, almost burnt sugar was going into the pot with the rest of the caramel, and it was going to make the difference between a frosting that tasted like candy and a frosting that tasted like something that had been taken to the edge. The caramel cake's reputation in black households across the South was built entirely on that frosting. The cake underneath was a yellow butter cake, soft and plain, a vehicle and nothing more, designed to hold layers of what went on top of it. Every experienced Southern baker who has ever attempted the frosting has a story that involves either triumph or surrender, and usually both in different years. The sugar cooks to softball stage, meaning the temperature has to reach between 234 and 240 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point a small drop of the mixture rolled into cold water will form a pliable soft ball that holds its shape without hardening. Below that temperature, the frosting will not set. Above it, the frosting crystallizes into something granular and stiff that cannot be spread and cannot be saved. The window between those two outcomes is measured in seconds, and the color shift in the sugar that tells you where you are in that window is subtle enough that you almost need to know what it looks like before you see it, as cookbook author Anne Byrne put it, because by the time it looks obviously done, it is already past done. Some grandmothers use the burnt sugar method. A portion of the sugar, sometimes a quarter cup, sometimes half a cup depending on the family tradition, went into a cast iron skillet alone and was cooked past amber, past the point any candy recipe would recommend, all the way to a dark, smoking brown that looked wrong to anyone who had not seen this done before. Then hot water went in, and the steam came up, and what remained was a concentrated dark syrup that tasted of something almost bitter, something complex and deep, and that syrup went into the main pot of sugar and butter and milk cooking on the adjacent burner. That addition changed the flavor of everything. It gave the finished frosting a note of bitterness underneath the sweetness that balanced the whole thing in a way that a frosting made only from white sugar and butter could not replicate, and it gave the color a depth that distinguished it from paler versions immediately, a dark amber that looked exactly like the candy it resembled. After the cooking, the pot came off the heat and vanilla extract went in without stirring, because stirring at that moment could cause the sugar to crystallize, and then the pot sat and cooled for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and the timing of when to begin beating it was another judgment that lived in the body of the person who had done this before. Too early and the frosting would be too thin to hold a shape. Too late and it would have stiffened past the point of spreading, having set up the way fudge sets up when it cools in the pan. The beating happened fast, with a wooden spoon or later an electric mixer, and the frosting went from glossy and liquid to thick and spreadable somewhere in those minutes, and the person making it had to know that moment and act on it, because there was no recovering from missing it in either direction. The spreading had its own urgency. Once the frosting reached spreading consistency, it needed to move from the pot to the cake in under 10 minutes, because it continued setting as it cooled, and a layer cake requires enough time to spread between the layers and across the top and down the sides, and every minute of delay made that task harder. Grandmothers who made this cake regularly had developed a physical rhythm around those final minutes, everything else cleared from the counter, the cake already on its stand, the spatula ready, moving from bowl to cake without any pause. Families who watched this process often reported it as the most intense cooking they ever witnessed, more focused than anything else that happened in that kitchen, a woman in total command of something that could turn against her at any moment. The caramel cake appeared in Southern communities after the Civil War, as layer cakes became a form of celebration that Black families could participate in on their own terms, in their own homes, for their own occasions. In many neighborhoods, the skill for this particular cake was held by a small number of women, and it was known who they were. Southern Living first published a formal caramel cake recipe in its December 1971 issue, by which point the cake had been made in Black households for nearly a century without any magazine taking notice. The recipe was requested for birthdays above almost any other dessert, and when a family had a grandmother who made it correctly, the request came every year, and the person making it understood what she was being asked to produce and what it would mean if she got it right. The part that could not survive her was the color. Not the color of the finished frosting, but the color of the sugar in the pan at the moment she pulled it, the specific shade of amber she had calibrated across years of practice and would not mistake for any other shade. That calibration was hers, and it went with her, and every attempt made afterward by people who loved her was working from a description of a thing they had seen but never controlled themselves. She never wrote it down because the important part could not be written. Up next, a dish that required no candy thermometer and no split-second timing, but still managed to be impossible to replicate, because the secret was not in the technique, but in a specific combination that each grandmother arrived at differently and kept entirely to herself. Section 12. Baked macaroni and cheese. 30 minutes after it came out of the oven, when the dish had rested long enough, she took the serving spoon and pressed it straight down into the center and lifted, and what came out held its shape. That was the first signal. Baked macaroni and cheese done correctly does not pour or slouch or separate when you serve it. It holds together, the macaroni suspended in a set custard the color of deep gold, the top browned and slightly pulled from the edges of the dish, the surface yielding to pressure but keeping its form below. You could have cut it with a knife. Some grandmothers did exactly that, slicing the pan into clean rectangular portions the way you would slice a casserole, because the egg in the binder had set the whole thing into something that behaved more like a terrine than a side dish. Stovetop macaroni and cheese and baked macaroni and cheese are not the same food with different preparation methods. They are different foods. The stovetop version is a sauce that coats the pasta and stays fluid, built on a roux that thickens the milk into something creamy and pourable, the kind of thing that moves when you serve it. The baked version is a custard that holds the pasta together from the inside out, built on eggs and milk and cheese layered into a dish, and transformed by an hour in a hot oven into something solid at the edges and creamy at the center. And the distinction between those two textures in the same pan was the whole point. Your grandmother knew which she was making and why, and the dish made no concessions to being something else. The history of macaroni and cheese in Black American kitchens runs through a specific person whose name has largely been removed from the story. James Hemings was born in 1765, enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, and trained as a chef de cuisine in Paris, while Jefferson served as American minister to France in the 1780s, making Hemings the first American trained at that level in French culinary tradition. When Jefferson returned to the United States in 1789, Hemings came with him and eventually cooked at state dinners in Washington, where he served what he called macaroni pie, a layered dish of pasta, butter, and sharp American cheese that adapted the French bechamel-based version he had learned abroad into something suited to the ingredients and the American table. The dish was served at Jefferson's formal dinners in the early 1800s, appeared in print in Mary Randolph's cookbook in 1824, and made its way from the plantation kitchen into Black households across the following century, where it became something Jefferson's dinner table never knew, a family recipe, guarded, personalized, claimed. The egg custard was what separated the Black American baked version from everything else. Eggs whisked with evaporated milk or whole milk or both, seasoned with garlic powder and dry mustard and a measure of paprika and sometimes a trace of cayenne, poured over the macaroni in the dish and allowed to settle down through the layers before the pan went into the oven. The eggs did two things during baking. They set the structure of the whole dish, converting the liquid around the macaroni into a firm, sliceable custard, and they carried the seasoning evenly into every part of the pan rather than concentrating it in the sauce. A properly made custard-based baked mac and cheese tasted seasoned from the inside, the way a good braise tastes seasoned rather than flavored from outside, and that came from the eggs. The cheese combination was the most private thing in this recipe. Sharp cheddar went in always, every version, because the sharpness of aged cheddar was the flavor foundation everything else was built on, and using mild cheddar produced something flat and unrecognizable as the dish. But what went in alongside the cheddar varied by household in ways that families rarely disclosed fully. Colby Jack for its melt and mild butter flavor. American cheese or Velveeta or Cheese Whiz in some versions, which sounds like a compromise but is not. Processed cheese contains emulsifying salts that keep the fats and proteins in the cheese from separating during baking, which is why dishes made with some processed cheese stay smooth and creamy, where all natural cheese versions can turn grainy or greasy at high heat. Cream cheese in certain versions for density and tang, sometimes mozzarella for its pull, sometimes Gouda for depth. One grandmother in Louisiana used 3 cheeses, another in Detroit used 5. A food editor at Ebony magazine described her family's version as including Cheese Whiz alongside the sharp cheddar and credited the combination with giving the dish its particular creaminess. None of these people were using the same recipe, but all of them called it the same thing, and all of them were right. The layering method divided grandmothers into 2 groups who were both absolutely certain they were correct. One approach, mix everything together in a large bowl, pour into the dish, bake. The other, layer the macaroni and cheese alternately, pasta, then shredded cheese, then more pasta, then more cheese. Pour the custard over the assembled layers, bake. The layered version produced pockets of concentrated cheese that the mixed version did not, and the mixed version produced a more uniform custard throughout that some found preferable, and neither approach produced what the other produced, and both were good, and neither was the same as what was made on the next street over. The pan that came back empty first at every Thanksgiving table was not the turkey. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just finished a dish that could feed a room and hold its shape doing it. The next recipe was the opposite of that, made from almost nothing, eaten immediately, and belonging to a tradition so old that most people alive today have never seen it made. Section 13. Pig's feet. The jar sat on the counter of places that have mostly closed now. A large glass jar, sealed with a metal lid, holding pig's feet suspended in a cloudy pink brine, the feet packed in tightly enough that they held their shape against the glass, the whole thing slightly reddish from the vinegar and the spices, and a person who knew what they were doing reached in without hesitation, shook the brine off gently, wrapped the foot in a piece of wax paper if there was wax paper, and ate it standing at the counter with hot sauce shaken over the top. This was the pickled version. It was its own entire tradition. The slow-cooked version was something else, and your grandmother likely made one or the other or both depending on who had taught her and what she had grown up eating, and both were correct. Pig's feet are exactly what the name says. The foot of the pig, cut at the lower leg, containing the bones of the ankle and toes, the skin, the tendons, the thick pad of the sole, and an extraordinary amount of collagen packed into the connective tissue between every structure in the foot. A foot that has been exercised by the weight and movement of a living animal for its entire life is a foot full of collagen, and collagen under low heat and time converts to gelatin, and gelatin gives the cooking liquid a body and a richness that no broth achieves on its own. This is what your grandmother understood about this cut, whether she would have used that word or not. She understood that something in that foot, given enough time, would give itself to the pot, and the result would be worth the time. The slow-cooked version began the way most of these dishes began, cleaned in cold water, scrubbed with salt, the hairs removed with a razor or a flame if there were any, then into a pot with onion, garlic, bell pepper, celery, bay leaf, black pepper, a pour of vinegar, and enough water to cover. The heat came up and stayed low. The feet simmered for 2 to 3 hours on the stovetop, sometimes longer, until the skin on the outside had gone from the tight, resistant surface of raw pork to something that yielded to a fork, the collagen in the tissue having made its full conversion, the cooking liquid having thickened around the bones into something that trembled when the pot was moved. The result was served hot, with more vinegar and hot sauce brought to the table separately, each person adding their own amounts, and the dish was eaten alongside collard greens or rice or cornbread or all three, the pot liquid serving as a gravy over whatever starch was on the plate. The pickled version took longer in calendar time but less active work. The feet were slow cooked first until fully tender, then transferred into a brine made from white vinegar, water, salt, sugar, bay leaves, cloves, garlic, and peppercorns, and the jar went into the refrigerator for several days, sometimes a full week. The acid of the brine worked into the soft skin and the meat over those days, pulling the flavor from the brine into the foot and replacing the cooking flavors with something sharper and more preserved. What came out after a week was a cold, tangy, gelatinous foot with a brine flavor that ran all the way through it, the exterior picking up pink from the vinegar, the interior still rich from the slow cooking but transformed by the acid into something more concentrated. This version was eaten cold, which meant the gelatin was fully set, which meant the texture was different again from the hot version, firmer and more substantial, and the eating of it was a different physical experience. Eating pig's feet required technique. This is one of the things that made the dish generationally transmitted in a way that went beyond the recipe. You had to learn how to eat them as well as how to make them. The foot has a complex bone structure, small bones at the toes and larger ones at the ankle, and the meat and skin and gelatin are distributed around those bones in a way that is not immediately obvious. The person who knew what they were doing worked their way around each bone methodically, finding where the skin came away cleanly and where the meat was hiding in the crevices between structures, eating efficiently without wasting anything worth eating. A person who had grown up doing this could finish a pig's foot and leave the bones clean. A person who had not grew up with this encountered the foot as a collection of obstacles and often left more on the bones than had been found. The New Year's tradition attached to pig's feet ran through black households across the South and through every northern city where Southern families had resettled during the Great Migration. Eating pig's feet on New Year's Day was understood to bring good luck in the coming year, part of a broader set of beliefs around foods consumed at that transition, the same tradition that prescribed black-eyed peas and collard greens for the holiday. The feet appeared on New Year's tables across the country, slow cooked the day before or the morning of, and the meal was both practical and ceremonial. A dish that carried meaning inside the act of eating it, that tied the table to something larger than the meal. The pickled version in its glass jar occupied a specific place in the geography of black commercial life. Corner stores, barbershops, bars, and small restaurants in black neighborhoods kept those jars on their counters through much of the mid-20th century. The jar was a given, the way a jar of pickles was a given in a deli, the way pork rinds in a bag were a given at certain counters. It was food for standing up, food for between other things, food that cost almost nothing and sustained the person eating it for longer than its price would suggest. As those neighborhoods changed and those businesses closed or moved, the jars went with them, and the specific experience of eating pickled pig's feet off wax paper at a counter that also sold number slips and single cigarettes went with them too. What the younger generation encountered, when they encountered this dish at all, was most often the texture. The gelatin was the barrier, a palate trained on foods that separated cleanly, that had consistent and predictable textures throughout, found the combination of soft skin and thick gelatin, and occasional resistance of tendon unsettling in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who had grown up eating it as normal. The flavor was there, available to anyone willing to stay with it. The texture required a willingness to accept that some food does not resolve into a single comfortable consistency, and that the part of the foot you had to work for was the most rewarding part. Your grandmother knew every inch of the bone. The next item on this list came from the same animal and required the same patience, but it lived in a different part of the hog and produced a result that was even less familiar to anyone who had not grown up at a table where it was simply what appeared on the plate without explanation. Section 14. Smothered chicken bone in pieces, always. That was the first decision, and it determined everything that followed. A boneless chicken breast has its own uses, and smothered chicken is not among them, because what the bone contributed during the long covered simmer was not meat but time, specifically the gelatin and collagen stored in the joint and cartilage that slowly dissolved into the cooking liquid and thickened the gravy from the inside without any additional flour, without any starch, without anything your grandmother added deliberately. The bone did it, she knew that and chose accordingly, reaching for thighs and drumsticks and sometimes a cut-up fryer when she was feeding a crowd, and the boneless version that appears in faster recipes is a different dish that happens to share the name. The seasoning went on the chicken before anything else happened. Salt and black pepper, always, worked into the surface of each piece, and then garlic powder and onion powder, and smoked paprika, and sometimes a measure of celery seed. The whole combination pressed into the skin and the flesh by hand, so it went beyond the surface and into the meat itself. Then the seasoned flour, in a shallow bowl or a paper bag depending on the family's preference, with more garlic powder and more pepper sifted into it, so that the coating carried its own flavor, rather than simply providing structure for the crust. The chicken went in and came out, shaken to remove the excess, and the excess flour went into a separate container because it was going back in later as the foundation of the gravy, and none of it was wasted. The pan went on high. Enough oil to come up the sides of the chicken pieces slightly. Not a full fry, but enough to develop a crust on every surface. And the chicken went in skin side down and stayed there without being touched until the skin had gone from pale to gold to something approaching dark amber. That color was the gravy in its future form. Everything your grandmother scraped up from the bottom of the pan later had been created during those first minutes of uninterrupted searing, the seasoned flour browning against the hot metal, the fat rendering out of the skin, the protein at the surface of the meat caramelizing in a way that no amount of broth or seasoning added later could reproduce. She pulled the chicken when the skin had done what it needed to do, which was not when it was cooked through but when the crust had fully formed, because it was going back in to finish later, under conditions completely different from the ones that built the crust. The onions went into the hot fat and drippings immediately after the chicken came out, and they cooked in the residue of the sear, absorbing the flavor from the pan bottom as they softened. Garlic followed, then celery in versions with Louisiana influence, then a heaping spoonful of that reserved seasoned flour, stirred continuously into the hot fat for 2 minutes until the rawness cooked out and the color deepened, building a roux that was closer to tan than white, and carried the smoky residue of the sear throughout. Then the broth went in, warm if she had it, working through the roux in stages, and she stirred it into something smooth and rich before it was allowed to thicken. Some grandmothers added a splash of whole milk at this stage to soften the color and round the flavor. Others did not touch the dark gravy, preferring its depth to any lightening. Both were right in their own kitchens. The chicken went back in, nestled into the gravy with the skin side up, and the lid went on, and the heat came down to its lowest setting, and what happened over the next 35 to 45 minutes was the dish becoming what it was. The covered pan created a self-contained environment of steam and heat and rendered fat, and the collagen in the bone joints dissolved slowly into the gravy that surrounded the meat, and the covered steam kept the meat from drying at the edges while the gravy continued to cook, and at the end the chicken had given the gravy something the pork chops could not give it. A richness that came from poultry fat and chicken-specific collagen, a body in the sauce that was thicker at the surface than it was underneath, and when you lifted a piece of chicken from the pan, the meat at the joint separated without resistance, the bone coming clean without any pulling needed. Smothered chicken occupied a specific position in the Sunday rhythm of black households that fried chicken did not occupy, because fried chicken required standing at the stove attending a hot pot of oil for the entire cooking time, which could not be done while also managing 4 other dishes. Smothered chicken, once assembled and covered, required almost no attention for the better part of an hour, which meant it could go on the back burner while everything else happened, and when the family came home from church, the house already smelled like the meal was nearly ready. It was called Sunday chicken in many households without anyone clarifying why the name was Sunday, because the reason was too obvious to need explaining. The rice underneath was white, always, cooked separately and loaded onto the plate first, and the chicken went on top and the gravy went over everything, running through the rice in a way that made each grain carry the flavor of the pot. The plate was one unified thing, the rice inseparable from the chicken, inseparable from the gravy, because they had been designed together even though they were cooked apart. What varied between grandmothers was largely invisible at the table. How far she took the sear before pulling the chicken. How long she cooked the roux before adding liquid. Whether the gravy ran thin like a broth or held thick like something close to stew. Whether she finished it with butter at the end or left it as it was. These were the details that lived in her hands and in her judgment, and they were the details that did not transfer. That rice sat in gravy nobody ever got exactly right again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just watched a bird give everything it had to a pot of gravy. The next recipe is quieter than most on this list, made from something humble, and it showed up at the holiday table not because anyone planned it, but because certain grandmothers simply refused to let a sweet potato end up as anything less than what it could be. Section 15, Sweet Potato Pudding. The box grater came out before anything else. Not the food processor, not the potato masher, not any tool designed to make the work faster. The box grater, set in a bowl or over a cutting board, and the raw sweet potato pressed against the medium holes and pulled downward in a short, firm stroke, again and again, until the bowl held a pile of thin orange strands, wet with the potato's own juice, and smelling faintly sweet and almost floral in a way the cooked potato did not, a rawness that would cook out in the oven and leave something else entirely. Your grandmother grated those potatoes by hand the way the recipe had always been done, because mashing them produced a different result and she was not making that. What she was making was not sweet potato pie. It had the same main ingredient and some of the same spices, and it came out of the same oven, but it was a different thing in every way that mattered. No crust, no smooth custard filling, nothing that could be sliced clean or placed on a dessert plate with any expectation of holding its form. Sweet potato pudding, also called pone in the older tradition, had a texture that defied every category it might have been placed in. The edges of the baking dish went dark and almost sticky as it cooked, the sugars in the potato caramelizing against the hot pan, and the center stayed soft and slightly trembling, and the interior was full of the visible strands of grated potato that had given up their structure to the surrounding egg and milk custard, but had not disappeared into it, still present as a texture beneath the softness. You could describe it to someone all day, and they would not know what you were talking about until they had eaten it. The word pone comes from the Algonquian word apan, meaning something baked or fried into a cake, a term that worked its way into Southern cooking through the long contact between Native American and Black communities in the colonial and antebellum South. The Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands made sweet potato pone, as did Black families across the Deep South and into the Caribbean, where similar preparations showed up under different names. The dish predates sweet potato pie in the sense that it requires no pie crust and no oven technique specific to pastry, only the potato and the bowl and whatever sweetener was available, and it is the older, more direct form of the dessert impulse. Grate what you have, mix it with fat and sugar and egg and spice, put it in the heat, and wait. The molasses was what made this pudding darker and more complex than the pie. Where sweet potato pie leaned on brown sugar and warm spice to build its sweetness, the pudding could take sorghum molasses or cane molasses as a primary sweetener, and molasses brought a bitterness underneath the sweet that rounded the whole thing into something more serious than dessert. The combination of molasses and grated sweet potato cooked together for nearly an hour produced a flavor that was almost savory at the edges and deeply sweet at the center, a range that the smooth pie filling could not manage because the pie had been processed into uniformity. The pudding retained the variation of the potato, sweeter strands from the interior of the root, more starchy ones from near the skin, and the variation showed up in the finished dish as a depth of flavor rather than a consistent note. Spice choices varied by family and by what was in the cabinet. Cinnamon and nutmeg were present in most versions as they were in the pie. Cloves went in some versions, adding a sharpness that cut through the molasses. Allspice, which carries its own complexity of cinnamon and nutmeg and clove simultaneously, appeared in others. Some grandmothers added orange zest, which brought a brightness that kept the molasses from going too heavy, and a few added a pinch of black pepper, which sounds wrong until you taste what it does to the sweet potato, lifting the whole thing slightly and giving it an edge that made the sweetness more interesting rather than less. The specific combination was not written down because it had been arrived at over years and was simply what this pudding tasted like in this house, and anyone who ate it knew that without needing to know what was in it. The dish existed in the ambiguous space between dessert and side dish in a way that almost nothing else on the holiday table did. April McGregor, whose book on sweet potatoes documented regional Southern traditions around the vegetable, noted that the late Southern writer and food authority Eugene Walter described sweet potato pone as ideal for breakfast alongside cold buttermilk and coffee, and that is not as strange a suggestion as it sounds if you have eaten the right version. It was not sweet in the way dessert is sweet. It was sweet in the way something is sweet that has been cooked from something genuinely good, where the sweetness is the flavor of the ingredient, rather than the flavor of the sugar that was added to it. At Thanksgiving, it appeared alongside savory dishes without embarrassment. It was served warm and then eaten cold out of the dish the next morning without anyone suggesting this was unusual. The reason sweet potato pudding is harder to find in younger memories than sweet potato pie has partly to do with form. The pie had a crust, a recognizable shape, a slice that behaved like a slice, and sat on a plate and read unambiguously as dessert. The pudding sat in whatever pan it was baked in, and you served yourself with a spoon, and the edges came up dark and caramelized and the center came up soft, and neither of those textures transferred cleanly to a serving plate. It was a food you ate from the dish, communally, not a food you presented. It did not plate well. It did not photograph well. It was delicious in a way that had nothing to do with how it looked, and in a culture that increasingly sorted food by its visual potential, this was a form of slow disappearance. What was held in the recipe was the grating itself. Not just the technique, but the specific coarseness, the size of the strands that determined how much the potato retained its texture through the baking and how much it dissolved into the custard. Too fine and the pudding went smooth and lost the quality that made it different from pie. Too coarse and the strands stayed too present, too individual, not unified enough with what surrounded them. Your grandmother's grater made a specific strand and she had never thought about that because she had never thought about it. It was simply the grater she used, and the pudding was simply the pudding, and both of those facts were the same fact. The bowl came to the table heavy, and nobody pretended to know what it was called. Next on this list, a dish that also came from the parts of the animal no one else wanted, but required more preparation, and more time, and more specific knowledge than almost anything else your grandmother ever made. And that knowledge is almost entirely gone now. Section 16. Chitterlings. The smell reached the street before you reached the door. Not a welcome smell to most people, not something you could mistake for anything else, and not something a household apologized for because the household that knew how to produce it correctly understood that the smell was the first sign of knowledge at work. A house where chitlins were being properly cleaned and cooked was a house where someone knew what they were doing, and the people who had grown up eating them knew the difference between the smell of a pot that had been handled correctly and the smell of one that had not, and the difference was significant and immediate. Your grandmother's kitchen smelled like something working through a long process, not like something wrong. Chitterlings are the small intestines of a pig. The historical record of how they arrived at the Black American table is the same record that runs through most of what appears on this list. Enslaved African Americans received the cuts their enslavers did not want, and the intestines fell into that category, and through a combination of West African culinary knowledge about preparing all edible parts of an animal and the specific necessity of making something nutritious from whatever was given, the chitlin became a tradition. By the time black families were building independent lives across the South after emancipation and then moving northward during the Great Migration, the dish moved with them not because it was forced upon them but because it had become theirs, seasoned and cooked in a specific way that was worth keeping. The name gave a circuit of music venues its identity. The Chitlin Circuit was the network of theaters, clubs, and halls across the South and in northern cities that served black audiences during segregation. The spaces where artists including Ray Charles, James Brown, Aretha Franklin, and B.B. King built their careers before mainstream venues were open to them. The name was not incidental. Chitlins and soul food were what you ate at these venues, and the circuit acknowledged that what sustained the culture and what sustained the body were inseparable. The cleaning was the recipe. Not the cooking, not the seasoning, not the serving, but what happened before any heat was applied. The hours spent at the sink working through a bucket of intestines, pulling away the inner membrane from each piece, removing excess fat, rinsing in cold water until the water ran clear, then soaking in vinegar water for 30 minutes to an hour, then rinsing again, then repeating the cycle until the person doing the cleaning was satisfied that what remained was clean enough to go in a pot. Traditional cleaning could take a full day. The CDC has documented that improperly cleaned chitterlings can carry Yersinia enterocolitica, a bacterium that causes serious illness, which is why the phrase your grandmother used when talking about cleaning chitlins was not casual. The cleaning was a safety matter and a flavor matter simultaneously, because a poorly cleaned pot tasted exactly like the cleaning that was skipped, and everyone who had eaten chitlins before could tell. The specific technique of cleaning was not written in any document your grandmother consulted. She had learned by doing it beside someone who had already done it many times, and that person had learned the same way, and the knowledge was physical, how to find the membrane by feel, how to tell when a section had been cleaned thoroughly by how it moved through the fingers, how many times the water needed to run clear before she was satisfied. The oldest accounts describe cleaning chitlins outdoors during winter hog killings, working in the cold air at a bucket of water, because the smell of the process was strong enough that most households preferred to keep it outside. By the time the dish moved into city apartments with no outdoor space, the cleaning happened at the kitchen sink with every window open, and the family understood that for one day, that was simply the state of the house. The cooking began after a preliminary boil in clean water, drained and discarded, which removed most of what remained of the cleaning process from the surface of the intestines. Then the chitlins went into a fresh pot with onion, garlic, bay leaves, and water or broth, and they simmered low for 3 to 4 hours, sometimes longer, until the texture changed from something rubbery and resistant to something tender and yielding that cut with a fork. Some grandmothers added hog maws to the pot alongside, the stomach lining of the pig, which cooked at the same rate and absorbed the same flavors, and went on the same plate. A measure of apple cider vinegar went in toward the end, cutting through the richness of the long broth and brightening everything without announcing itself as an ingredient. The finished chitlins were served with hot sauce, always, and more vinegar on the side, and the combination of the two against the soft, savory intestine was the specific taste that people who had grown up with this dish could recall with complete clarity decades later. New Year's was the primary occasion. Thanksgiving and Christmas followed. The holiday framing was not arbitrary. These were the moments when extended family gathered and the kitchen could accommodate the full-day labor the dish required. And these were the moments when a grandmother who knew how to make them properly was surrounded by the people who had grown up eating them and who understood what they were being given. At some tables, the chitlins arrived alongside fried chicken and collard greens and mac and cheese, and the chitlins were not a curiosity or a side note. They were the centerpiece, the dish that told you something specific about where you were and who had made the meal. The generation that cleaned them properly is getting older. The knowledge of how to do the cleaning correctly, how to tell by feel and smell whether a batch is ready for the pot, does not have many places left to transfer to. That smell was proof of knowing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just spent a full day cleaning something most people walked away from. Up next, a dish that required no cleaning at all. Only the leftover pot that had already been working all week, and the knowledge of what to do with what remained. Section 17. Salmon croquettes. The can opener going around the rim was the first sound, and then the lid came back and the smell hit immediately. That specific salt and fish smell of canned pink salmon that is not a subtle smell and is not meant to be. And your grandmother did not flinch from it because she had been opening that can her whole life and she knew what it was going to become. She tilted the can over the bowl and let the liquid drain off, and then the salmon came out in a solid pink cylinder that she broke apart with a fork, working through it until it was fully flaked. And then she did the thing that surprised people who had not grown up watching it. She left the bones in. The bones in a can of salmon are soft enough to eat, cooked down to almost nothing during the canning process. And when they went into the bowl and got mashed through the mixture, they contributed calcium and body and disappeared entirely into the finished patty. She did not explain this. She simply did it, the way she did everything else in that kitchen without explaining it, and the result was correct. Then came the decision that divided every grandmother from every other grandmother, the binder. The question of what held a salmon croquette together was not a simple one, and the answer varied by household in a way that was entirely personal and entirely non-negotiable. Crackers crushed into fine crumbs by hand or by a rolling pin across the bag gave a slightly salty, buttery quality to the interior of the patty and absorbed the moisture from the salmon in a way that flour did not quite replicate. Flour worked differently, giving the outside of the patty a crisper crust when it hit the hot oil, but producing a slightly denser interior. Cornmeal gave the exterior a texture that crackled faintly between the teeth at the very edges of the crust, which certain grandmothers preferred above everything else. Some used a combination of two binders. Some used saltines so specific to the brand that they would not substitute another cracker if that brand was unavailable. The binding was not a secondary detail. The binding was half of what made your grandmother's version different from the one made on the next street over. The onion went in raw in most versions, diced small enough to disappear into the mixture during frying, without creating visible chunks that would disrupt the texture of the finished patty. Some grandmothers cooked it first, sautéing it in a little butter before adding it to the bowl, and that version produced a softer, sweeter onion flavor in the finished croquette that the raw version did not. Bell pepper went into certain households and not others. Garlic powder went in almost everywhere. Worcestershire sauce in some versions added a fermented depth underneath the salmon flavor. A squeeze of lemon juice in others brightened the whole mixture. An egg, always for binding, worked through gently because the mixture could not be overworked any more than a biscuit dough could be overworked. Too much handling made the finished patty dense and uniform in a way that was wrong, and your grandmother stopped mixing when it looked right, which was a judgment she had made enough times that it required no deliberation. The patties went into shape by hand. She took a handful of the mixture and pressed it into an oval or a round between her palms, firm enough to hold together but not so compressed that it would be tight in the center when it cooked. The size was consistent across a batch because her hand was consistent, and the patties she produced were as uniform as anything made by a machine except for the slight variations at the edges that meant they had been made by a person. She set them aside on a plate, and if the mixture had been right in the first place, they held their shape without any refrigeration needed, though some grandmothers put them in the refrigerator for 20 or 30 minutes to firm them further before the pan went on. The cast iron skillet came out. Oil in the bottom, not a deep fry, but enough to come up the sides of the patty partway, and the heat came up to medium-high before anything went in, because dropping a croquette into oil that had not reached temperature meant the binder would absorb the oil rather than fry in it, and the result was heavy and greasy rather than crisp. When the oil was ready, she laid the patties in without crowding them, and the sound they made going into the hot oil was specific and satisfying, a sustained immediate sizzle that meant the temperature was correct. 3 minutes on the first side, roughly, without moving them, letting the crust develop fully before any flip, because a crust that is interrupted in its forming never fully recovers. The flip happened in a single, unhurried motion, spatula flat under the patty, turned and laid down again, and the second side cooked for slightly less time, because the interior was already warm. Canned salmon arrived in the American South through a combination of deliberate marketing and economic crisis. Production had been centered in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest since the mid-19th century, with more than 200 canneries operating along the northwest coast by the early 1900s, producing canned pink and chum salmon that initially found little market at home. Alaskan canneries, looking for distribution, began targeting the American South specifically, and by the early 1900s, the South had become the primary domestic market for Alaska pink salmon. The Great Depression accelerated what the marketing had started. At less than 5 cents a can, canned salmon was one of the most affordable proteins available during the 1930s, and New Deal programs subsidized its distribution further in response to widespread nutritional deficiency in the South, where corn-heavy diets had created widespread pellagra, a vitamin B3 deficiency disease. By the time the Depression ended and the country entered the post-war era, canned salmon had been a staple in black Southern kitchens for 2 decades, and the croquette made from it had become a standard of the weekday table. Friday was the primary occasion in households with any Catholic influence, which in the South included many black communities shaped by Louisiana Creole traditions that ran through the region's culinary culture. A meatless Friday meant fish, and canned salmon was what fish meant in a household without access to fresh catch. The croquette was fast enough to make after a full day of work, used ingredients that kept on a shelf indefinitely, fed a family on the contents of 1 or 2 cans, and produced something that was genuinely good in a way that the modesty of its ingredients did not prepare you for. Your grandmother served it over white rice or alongside grits or with a slice of white bread that you pressed against the crust to get the oil from the pan, and hot sauce went on the side and so did ketchup, and you chose your own and no one commented on the choice. What made each grandmother's version specific was the binding judgment, the visual and tactile read of the mixture in the bowl before any patty was formed. Too wet and the patties fell apart in the oil, which was the failure mode everyone feared. Too dry and the interior came out dense and tight. The right consistency had a specific look and feel that your grandmother recognized the way she recognized everything else in that kitchen, from accumulated making rather than from any written standard. The egg she added was the variable she adjusted based on how the mixture looked, adding a little more if it seemed too loose, or a little more cracker if it seemed too wet, calibrating the whole thing by eye until it looked like what she was used to seeing, which was what it needed to be. The plate came back empty every time. Up next, a rice dish that traveled across an ocean and survived 3 centuries with its technique essentially intact, and when you put the lid on the pot you could still taste where it came from. Section 18. Red rice. Before you tasted it you could see it, and the color told you something. Not white rice, not yellow rice, not anything that came out of a plain pot of salted water. Red rice arrived at the table already transformed. The grains stained a deep red orange from the tomato liquid they had absorbed during the long covered cook, each one separate and firm but carrying the color all the way through, not coated at the surface but changed in its interior, and the smell of it coming from the pot was pork fat and onion and tomato and smoke layered together in a way that told you someone had built this dish in stages, rather than simply combined the ingredients and waited. The pot started with the fatback or bacon or smoked sausage depending on the family and the occasion, cooked in the bottom of a heavy pot until the fat had rendered out and the pork had taken on color. Then onion went in, and bell pepper, and sometimes celery alongside, the same aromatic base that ran through so much of the cooking that came out of the low country of South Carolina and coastal Georgia, cooked down in the pork fat until soft and beginning to caramelize at the edges. Then the tomato, either paste worked in to coat everything or crushed whole tomatoes added to the pot, and then the water or broth, and when that mixture came to a simmer the dry rice went in, and the lid went on, and the heat came down, and the rice cooked in that tomato and pork liquid rather than in plain water, and became something that plain water rice could not become. The connection between this dish and West Africa runs deeper than most people who eat it know. The Gullah Geechee people, descendants of enslaved Africans who were brought specifically to the South Carolina and Georgia coast for their expertise in rice cultivation, trace a direct culinary line from West African jollof rice to this dish. Jollof rice, which has been eaten across Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, and the broader West African region for centuries, is rice cooked in a spiced tomato broth with aromatics and meat, a one-pot approach to a complete meal that travels instantly recognizable to anyone who has eaten Gullah red rice and understood it as a relationship rather than a coincidence. When enslaved Africans arrived in the Low Country, they brought that knowledge with them, and using the ingredients available in the new landscape, they built a version of the thing they already knew how to make. What they also brought, and what made the colony wealthy beyond any other in North America, was the knowledge of how to grow rice in the first place. The planters of colonial South Carolina demanded enslaved people specifically from the rice coast of West Africa, the coastal regions of what are now Senegal, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, where wetland rice farming had been practiced for generations. Those enslaved people cleared the land, constructed the elaborate networks of levees and dikes and sluices and floodgates that converted hundreds of thousands of acres of maritime forest into productive rice fields, planted the grain using the traditional African heel and toe technique, harvested it by hand, and hulled it in carved wooden mortars and pestles. They wove the sweetgrass fanner baskets used for winnowing the grain from the chaff, a basket weaving tradition that was African in origin and that their descendants in the Gullah communities of South Carolina still practice today. South Carolina's encyclopedia notes that, from seed to table, Carolina gold rice, the variety that made the colony its fortune, was the domain of the enslaved. By 1860, the state produced 70% of all the rice grown in the United States. Emily Meggett, who was the matriarch of the Gullah community on Edisto Island, South Carolina, described her red rice in her 2022 cookbook by saying that it went back to the old days, the days before her mother, and before her mother. She was in her late 80s when she wrote that, and the change she was describing ran back before emancipation, before the Civil War, before the formation of the United States as a country. The dish had not started as something humble. It had started as something that people who knew rice deeply had made from a place of genuine skill, in communities that had been cooking rice for longer than the colony around them had existed. The challenge of red rice that most recipes do not fully convey was the moisture. Tomatoes contain water in variable amounts depending on the variety, the ripeness, and whether they went in as paste or as whole fruit, and rice is unforgiving of excess moisture during the final stage of cooking. Too much liquid and the grains split and turn to mush, the whole dish losing the texture that made it specific. Too little and the rice did not cook through, and sat hard and undercooked at the center of the pot. Your grandmother calibrated this the way she calibrated everything else in her kitchen, by the look and the smell and the feel of the pot at each stage, adjusting the liquid as she went, rather than following a fixed measurement, and arriving at the right result through attention rather than formula. She knew what it should look like when the lid came off after 30 minutes, and she knew what to do if it did not look right, and both of those things lived in her hands rather than on a page. The dish traveled inland and northward with black families during the Great Migration, spreading from the coastal communities where it had been born into cities across the South and then into Chicago and New York and Detroit, where families from South Carolina and Georgia carried it as a piece of what they were. In each new kitchen, it absorbed the specifics of that household, the particular sausage that was available, the particular brand of canned tomato that became the family's standard, the particular ratio that a specific grandmother had worked out across years of making it, and those specifics became the recipe, even though they were never written down as one. The grains came out separate and stained and tasting like everything the pot had held. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just sat down to a table built on 3 centuries of rice knowledge. The next dish also arrived at the table after a long wait, having spent time in a brine before a single bite was taken, a dish that tested the patience of everyone who made it, and rewarded only the people who knew what they were waiting for. Section 19, Crackling Bread. The skillet was already in the oven before the batter was ready. That was how it worked, and you knew it because you had watched it enough times. The cast iron going in with a tablespoon of lard or bacon drippings while the oven came up to temperature, the fat melting and coating the bottom of the pan while the batter came together at the counter, and when the batter went in, it went into a hot, fat-slicked pan and the edges sizzled immediately on contact, setting up a crust before the bread had even started to bake. That sizzle meant the bottom was already becoming what a bottom of cornbread was supposed to become, and the rest would follow from there. Your grandmother had done this often enough that the sequence was automatic. The skillet into the oven first, always, as a reflex rather than a decision. Crackling bread is cornbread with cracklings folded into the batter. What cracklings are is specific and matters. They are not pork rinds, not chicharrones, not the airy fried pork skin sold in bags at every gas station in the South. Cracklings are the solid residue left in the pot after pork fat has been rendered into lard, the pieces of skin and fat and sometimes small amounts of meat that remain after the liquid fat has been poured off and the pot has cooled. They are dense rather than airy, slightly chewy rather than crisp throughout, and they carry the full flavor of the pork fat that surrounded them during rendering in a way that the dried, puffed version does not. The difference between fresh cracklings and a bag of pork rinds is the difference between what comes from a process and what comes from a package, and that difference goes all the way through the bread. The crackling bread in your grandmother's kitchen came directly out of hog killing season, which in the rural South happened in late November and early December when the cold was sufficient to keep meat from spoiling during the butchering process. After the animal was processed and the hams were salted and the bacon was going to be smoked and the chops were cut and the chitlins and hog maws were cleaned and the feet were going into the brine, someone was rendering the fat. The raw pork fat went into a large pot over low heat and was cooked slowly until all of its liquid had separated and become lard, and when the lard was poured off and saved for the months of cooking ahead, what was left at the bottom of the pot was the crackling, dense, slightly golden, smelling of rendered pork, full of flavor, and available to anyone who wanted to use it. They went into the cornbread that day or the next day, because fresh cracklings did not keep the way lard did, and the bread that came from them was different from any other cornbread made any other way. The recipe for crackling bread was among the simplest on this list. Cornmeal, not a blend of cornmeal and flour in the way that softer modern cornbreads use, but cornmeal predominantly, or exclusively, giving the finished bread a density and a slightly gritty character that buttermilk cornbread approaches but does not quite replicate. Salt, baking soda, buttermilk, and an egg were the other components, mixed together just until combined, because overworking cornbread batter produced a tougher result, and your grandmother knew this the way she knew every other thing about her kitchen, through repetition and result, rather than through reading. The cracklings went in last, folded through the batter in pieces large enough to hold their identity as the bread baked, rather than dissolving entirely into the crumb. In Harper Lee's 1960 novel, the character Calpurnia, the black cook who worked in the Finch household in Alabama, makes crackling bread for Scout after a hard day at school. Lee wrote that Calpurnia did not often make it, saying she never had time, but that with both children away at school that day had been an easy one. She knew Scout loved it. The detail that crackling bread was rare even when it existed, that it required a particular set of circumstances to produce, and was therefore a gift when it appeared, is accurate to the tradition. This was not bread you made on any ordinary day. It was bread you made when the cracklings were there, and the oven was hot, and time was available, and the desire was present, and all of those conditions did not often align simultaneously. The texture of the finished bread is impossible to fully describe to someone who has not eaten it. The outside crust from the hot skillet was firm and slightly dark, the color and character that only cast iron with fat already in it can produce. The interior was dense and tender, the cornmeal giving it a particular weight in the hand. And then, distributed through that interior, were the cracklings, each one a small concentration of rendered pork, slightly different in texture from the bread around it, a little more resistance before it gave way, and a burst of fat and salt and smoke that changed what that particular bite tasted like entirely. The bread around the cracklings tasted like good cornbread. The bite that hit a crackling tasted like something older than the recipe. The chain that produced this bread is almost entirely gone from Black American kitchens. Rendering lard from raw pork fat is not a practice that most households maintain, and without the rendering there are no cracklings, and without cracklings the bread becomes a different thing. Bagged pork rinds can be folded into cornbread and the result is edible and sometimes good, but the pork rind is fully dried, and it behaves differently in the batter, softening in a way that loses the specific texture of the fresh crackling, the slight resistance and the burst of fat that were the point. What most people who grew up eating crackling bread encounter when they try to make it now is a version that is close enough to remind them and different enough to remind them of the difference, which is its own particular experience. The bread came from what was left after everything else had already been taken. It was the last thing the hog gave, and your grandmother made it into something worth remembering. What comes next is the last item on this list, and it is not really a recipe at all. It is what stays in the pot after everything else has been served, and it is the reason your grandmother never threw away the liquid at the bottom of a pot of greens. It was the oldest thing at the table and the hardest to name, and she knew exactly what to do with it. Section 20. Pot liquor. After the greens came out, the pot was not empty. That is the thing your grandmother understood and that many people after her forgot. The pot was not empty. The greens had cooked for 3 hours in water with a smoked ham hock and onion and garlic and black pepper and whatever else had gone in, and now the greens were on the plate, and the ham hock was on the plate, and the pot was sitting on the back burner with what looked like dark, smoky water in the bottom of it. You might have looked at it and thought the cooking was done. Your grandmother looked at it and saw the next step: pot liquor. The name comes from pot liquor, a term used in the American South since at least the early 1800s, to describe the broth remaining after greens have been slow cooked with smoked meat, and by the 1850s it was a mainstay of Southern diets, present in households across lines of class and color in a way that few other dishes were. The word liquor was a dialectal pronunciation specific to the region, the spelling particular enough that in 1931 it became a point of national contention. Louisiana Senator Huey Long and President Franklin D. Roosevelt argued publicly, in the middle of the Great Depression, about the proper way to eat pot liquor with cornbread. Long insisted the cornbread must be dunked whole, held by the hand and dragged through the liquid, while Roosevelt maintained it should be crumbled into the pot and eaten with a spoon. The debate was covered in newspapers across the country. The Atlanta Constitution received more than 600 letters to the editor on the subject. The Southern Foodways Alliance director John T. Edge later wrote his graduate school thesis on what became known as the pot liquor and corn pone debate of 1931. In June 1935, Long went to the floor of the United States Senate and entered into the congressional record a full description of how to prepare pot liquor, which may be the only time a recipe for greens broth has been preserved in federal legislative record. The history behind the thing in the pot ran longer than any senator's speech. Enslaved African Americans were sometimes given the liquid that remained after greens were cooked for the plantation household, the broth that had absorbed everything the greens had released during hours of low heat. What might have seemed like waste to the person pouring it off was, to the person receiving it, something that was still warm and still full of what the greens had given up: vitamins A and C and K, iron, the fat and smoke of the pork that had cooked alongside the vegetables. Carried back to their quarters and sopped with cornbread or poured over rice, it was sustenance from the part of the meal that had been discarded. It sustained people during periods when sustaining themselves was its own form of persistence. The cornbread at the bottom of a bowl of pot liquor, whether crumbled or dunked, absorbed the liquid over the course of the meal and became something between bread and soup, softened and smoky and pork-flavored, and the whole bowl by the end was a unified thing rather than separate components. Jessica B. Harris, whose 2011 book High on the Hog traced African American foodways from West Africa, across the Atlantic and through centuries of American cooking, described the traditional West African meal structure as a soupy stew served over a starch, a structure that had persisted through 4 centuries of the most violent disruption imaginable. Sopping pot liquor with cornbread was not a variation on that structure. It was that structure, transplanted and adapted and still recognizable, carried by the people who had brought the practice with them, and kept making it in whatever form the New World allowed. Folk medicine attached itself to pot liquor in black households the way it attached itself to other foods that had kept people alive through hard seasons. It was given to sick children as a warm tonic, understood to contain something the body needed even if no one was naming the vitamins. It was prescribed by grandmothers and great-grandmothers in the same matter-of-fact way that every remedy in that household was prescribed, from a position of accumulated knowledge that required no external validation. Edna Lewis, the Virginia-born chef and cookbook author who spent her career documenting the cooking of the American South, wrote that the broth from cooked greens was too good and too nutritious to waste, which was the same thing your grandmother knew, and the same thing that needed no explanation at the time. What pot liquor holds in common with every other item on this list is not a technique or an ingredient, but a refusal. Your grandmother did not pour it down the drain because she did not pour things down the drain that still had something left in them. The neck bones still had flavor for the rice. The oxtail still had collagen for the broth. The sweet potato still had enough to give after the pie was made. The pot after the greens were done still had enough to make the cornbread worth eating twice, once as bread and once sopped in what the greens had left behind. Every dish on this list was made by someone who looked at what others had discarded and saw a meal. The pig's feet, others left at the counter. The hog maws, others would not clean. The caramel, other bakers were afraid to take too far. The cracklings left in the bottom of the lard pot. The liquid left in the bottom of the greens pot. You grew up at a table where nothing was wasted, and you did not think of it as a philosophy. you thought of it as how your grandmother cooked. The pot liquor went into a cup or onto the cornbread or into the next pot of something, and the bowl that held the greens got scraped clean. And by the end of the meal, the kitchen held nothing that still had something to offer, because she had taken everything. That is what these 20 recipes were. That is what the hands that made them knew. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.